This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Julie Scanlon, and in this new series I'm excited to introduce you to coaches, experts and changemakers who share their insights on coaching women in the context of advancing systemic change. Our aim is to inspire and educate you to contribute to shaping to a more gender equal world. It's my absolute pleasure to speak today with Geraldine Gallacher, CEO of the Executive Coaching Consultancy and author of Coaching Women, Changing the System, Not the Person, which was published in 2022. In this episode, we clarify what is meant by the system or systemic, how and why coaching is important for women early in their careers, and the context of increasing demands on productivity and capitalism. Hello everyone, I'm really pleased today to be speaking with Geraldine Gallacher for the podcast on coaching women, and today we're particularly going to be thinking about coaching and systemic change, and I'm very, very fortunate to have Geraldine as my guest today, who is CEO of the Executive Coaching Consultancy and the author of a book which came out just at the end of 2022 called Coaching Women, Changing the System, Not the Person. So it's wonderful to have you here speaking with us, Geraldine, today. And I wondered if you wanted to give a little bit more of an introduction to yourself, tell us a bit about your background and also your motivation for writing that book, Coaching Women.
Well, good morning, Julie, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak about the book, as you say, that came out just at the beginning of the year, end of last year. And so what should I say? In terms of who I am CEO of Executive Coaching Consultancy, now an author. I'm a mother and new grandmother as well, very recently, step-grandmother. And I set up executive coaching in 1994. So I actually was quite ahead of the game when it comes to recognising the value of one-to-one coaching. And indeed, when I set the company up, people thought I was setting up a bus company, one of those posh buses. So in actual fact, people really weren't acquainted with the idea of executive coaching. I've been running the company now since 1994. We now have 90 coaches internationally. And we really scaled around 2005 on the recognition that we were mainly coaching men. And that, if you like, pivoted us to focus much more on why so few women leaders. And now I think that's what we're known for, although we, of course, coach men and women. We're known for our work in the gender diversity space. And I think it was the recognition, quite late in my career really, that we were mainly coaching men that triggered the sojourn that I've had, where I've recognised how much our system is not geared actually to produce women leaders. And therefore, my journey towards trying to make some change in that area. So we now run women leadership programs all around the world, and but the main product that we launched with this new focus was parental transition coaching, recognizing that a lot of the women that we were coaching, the transition to becoming a mother, had a huge impact on their career trajectory. And so really the book is the culmination of the coaching that I've done and my company have done since 2005, since we recognised that there were too few women leaders.
Fantastic, Geraldine. So you've got such a vast experience there and depth of experience that has been brought to the book, which is really obvious when one reads it. Is your experience mostly in the corporate sector, or is it kind of broader than that, just to help listeners kind of situate that context a little?
It's definitely mostly in the corporate sector. That's the focus. Personally, I've coached across. I've coached in charities, I've coached in the public sector. But really, the main focus of the work has been changing the corporate world to incorporate more diverse leadership.
Fantastic and much needed as well, the kind of intervention that you're doing both in your work and in publishing this book from that experience. So can you tell us a little bit about what is covered within the book? What points of interest would you want to bring out for our listeners?
Well, first of all, it's in two halves, which I think is quite important. I recognised as a reader myself the importance of chunking it so that it was in manageable chunks. And people say, which is very insulting, Julie, but very often people say the best thing about your book, Geraldine, is you can fit it in a bag and carry it on the tube, which I have to say, the culmination of 4 years' work is rather upsetting. But nonetheless, I can thank my publisher for printing it with such small print that it actually is quite a small book, and about 120 pages, in fact. And so, yes, it's split into two. The first half is about my experiences of coaching women, and what I've done is I've used case studies to convey certain key themes that I felt were critical to what makes it different to coach a woman than coach a man. So the first half is around case studies. The second half, I broaden it out more and talk about coaching the system. So it's more about how does one change the system, what's wrong with the system, what needs to be changed, and indeed has chapters, for example, on how do we engage men in this change, because I recognise that this isn't something that, it's not a net zero focus. You have to actually have men and women wanting to change things up for it to actually happen. I talk about how leadership is changing so that it's moving to a more inclusive style of leadership. And then finally, I talk about what I think are the big themes that cause perhaps why we've got ourselves into this position in the first place, where it's quite hard for anyone who wants to have a kind of fulfilling personal life, a rich life, how hard it is to have a career in the kind of corporate environments in which I coach.
Yeah, fantastic, Geraldine. A really incisive, just sort of a brief insight really into some of the fascinating areas that the book covers, I think. So before, I'll kind of just probe a little deeper into some of those areas in a second. But first of all, I wonder if we can kind of clarify for listeners what we mean when we're talking about the system, because some people are not perhaps familiar with that term or thinking about sort of the systemic issues that we're referring to. So I wonder if we can just start to scope out what you mean by that within the book.
You're quite right, Julie. I actually have found in my work sometimes when I'm presenting and talking about the system, making an assumption that everyone understands what I mean, that actually I had one particular managing partner of a law firm actually saying, I honestly don't know what you're talking about. It sounds like you're talking about 1950s Russia. And I was like, oh God, I had no idea that was not a really common expression. So the best expression of description of what the system is, for me, does exist in the David Foster Wallace, I can't remember if that's his name, and his address to a university, where he talks about the two young fish swimming around the goldfish bowl, and they're swimming along and an older fish swims in the other direction and says, how's the water? And the two young fish swim on and say, what water? And that, I think, is a really good expression of the system. It's really everything around us that, we operate within. We operate within systems. And the system that I'm particularly talking about is the corporate system in which we work. But of course, there's a bigger, wider system, which is our culture, societal, that is a broader canvas in which I'm talking about. I'm specifically focusing in on the system of, I guess, Western capitalism. Yeah. Really is the system that I'm really talking to in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's big chunky stuff. And yeah, I love that David Foster Wallace example which you use within the book, because it really helps us see how some people swim around quite literally not seeing that we are held within these structures, kind of whether we like it or not. We're supported or challenged by those structures. For some of us, the water is a good thing and it helps us swim fluidly. I'm extending a metaphor ad hoc here. I'm hoping it's kind of working. But, for some of us, it can be difficult to breathe within that water. What if you're not that standard fish? You might be something else. You might be an elephant. So it's like how the structures and basically the kind of the way that we do things around here kind of can support some people and not other people, can kind of challenge other people. It's a bit like having a kind of wallpaper which after many years you don't notice as well. It's sort of a...
Absolutely. We just take it for granted that this is the way it's always been. And I think in the book I share quite a lot of personal stories about myself and the system. And one of the things that comes through is that in my early 20s, as a graduate trainee at the Ford Motor Company, and I think I was the only woman that year to join in the sales and marketing division, and how I took for granted the system that I was in and assumed that it was quite normal. I was operating in an entirely male environment and didn't really question it. And it's interesting that I then went on to coach, set up an organisation, was coaching mainly men. And then it was Emma Spitz that joined me from one of the banks on her second maternity leave that really drew my attention to the fact that we're not really operating in a level playing field. And the idea that we're operating in a meritocracy is just erroneous.
Yeah, and gives us that a false sense. We're kind of encouraged to feel that we are operating in a meritocracy through the capitalist world, which we'll kind of come back to, I guess, as well. But the idea that anyone can be anything if only you work hard enough. And actually, you've used that term level playing field there, that it's not a level playing field for when we start out. Even our kind of family histories are kind of already shaping who we are going to become and our kind of positions within the world. So, but yes, until we see it, we don't see it, because perhaps we swallow that idea that the world is equitable and if we work hard enough we can get there. And I suppose that you do talk about really nicely some kind of realization moments in your own career that helped you see actually things are not kind of quite right here through sort of your coaching clients, but also your own experiences. And I think that the mix of the personal and the sort of the larger scale just really comes out really nicely within your book, and that very self-aware and very self-reflective approach that you take to the writing, I think is really adds value to help us think about us as coaches now and how we support or don't support this world as well.
Thank you, Julie. And actually, the decision to include my own stories as I went through wasn't an upfront conscious decision. It just emerged as I wrote. I was actually having realizations as I wrote, so I thoroughly enjoyed writing the book. People find that quite surprising, because there were times when I was writing the book when I was stuck and it didn't feel as enjoyable. But actually, the process of writing the book was very cathartic. And it happened on two levels. One was it really gave me the opportunity to research the subject. And, I think I'm a bit of a, frustrated researcher. I really enjoyed the reading. I really enjoyed it. But the other side of it was, as I was researching, I was becoming more and more aware of the system and its impact on me. And it was making me recall points in my own life where I'd been blissfully unaware of, and one of them, Julie, as you painfully might remember, is appearing in the graduate training brochure of Ford Motor Company when I was a few years in, as a double-page spread in the graduate training brochure with me doing the splits in a leotard. God knows why I thought that was okay and accepted that. And all the other guys had a single page, and they're in their running shorts or on the football field. And there was me and my dad, because I used to teach dancing when I was younger. So, and I genuinely didn't question it, which is absurd.
But, I guess those were times when we had those images around us, the media images and the portrayals of women were, we saw, semi-sexualized or very different, well, we still see, I guess, but, very different portrayals of men and women. But that was in your kind of workplace brochure is really, it's just Absolutely. Really fascinating. And kind of us quite naively going through those different scenarios before we start to recognise, looking back, hang on a minute, that wasn't quite right there, or why was I being portrayed differently, or why was that happening?
And I think probably without it being a conscious choice as such, the other thing I noticed with my career is I gravitated from Ford Motor Company, I mean, goodness, a car manufacturer, and then I went to management development in fashion retail. So I was surrounded by women, but funnily enough, well, not surprisingly really at the time, this was the 90s, most of the directors, or all of the directors actually at one point, of all the women's fashion retail companies that I was head of management development there, were men as well, even though, you know, Topshop, Dorothy Perkins, Debenhams, a lot of these shops, as you know, are frequented by women, but actually at the time there still was mainly men running the show. And again, it didn't ever cross my mind to question that. I thought that was all perfectly normal.
Yeah.
So I wasn't a big feminazi when I was younger at all. So this has been a kind of slow dawning realisation that the system isn't a level playing field. And funnily enough, even my own experience of becoming a mother wasn't similar to other people's experience. It actually is through coaching so many women who are in the system. It's their experiences that I'm talking to in the book, because I'd already set up the executive coaching company before I became a mother. So therefore, I didn't experience that flatlining of my career at all. I'd already set ECC up. We grew. And, you know, the fact is that I guess, created a culture around me that happens to be very conducive to people who are different.
I mean, that's fascinating, really, that you've gained some of that experience and insight through your coaching clients, through coaching women, and also men, I guess, as well. And I guess kind of you use that term flatlining there, which has made me kind of come back to this notion of leadership, which you're talking about in the book, and obviously you touched on there, and how in the book you use a kind of image of the broken bridge for women not progressing beyond a certain stage in their career. You know, when they get to that kind of certain point, for many women, not all, it kind of comes along with parenthood, with becoming mothers. So just wondered if you wanted to explore that concept of sort of the flat line or the broken bridge in terms of the traditional styles of leadership, but also when you touched on a little earlier, the way that concepts of leadership are shifting somewhat, and our expectations of leaders, we hoping, might be more amenable to, you know, to having more diversity in there.
Yeah, well, let me start with maybe explaining the broken bridge very, very quickly. As I see it, when I coach, and mainly this is through women's leadership development programs, and we're very keen to get to women when they're quite young, in their 20s, late 20s, early 30s. And the reason for that is, for years we were coaching women who'd become pregnant. So we were coaching parental transition coaching. And actually what we were noticing with a lot of these high-flying bankers and lawyers, we were noticing that many of them had checked out of the leadership track already. And so that made us think, crikey, you know, we need to get to women earlier to make sure that they're not opting out of this or being opted out or eased out earlier. And so then we designed a program which we call Accelerate, and which our clients call different things, where we get younger women together to talk about leadership. And so the broken bridge is that when we first came across this group of women, what we find, and we still find this, is that there's a resistance to having a women-only program. Not from everyone, but there is a kind of core, and it's usually the types like me that are against it. So I would have been one of those people in my 20s that would have said, my goodness, here I am at the Ford Motor Company, I've just done an MBA, and I'm doing fine. And so it's that kind of individualist type A personality that thinks, well, I'm breaking through, so therefore there isn't a problem. And there is an element of the idealism of youth, because you're just naturally optimistic, so you think that the problem is solved. And also because coming through the education system, women are, you know, there's no question that women are winners in the sense that they're coming out usually with more first-class degrees. You know, they're coming out doing very well through education. So they've got used to kind of being in the driving seat. And so, and I know from some of my clients that have got quite in male-dominated sectors, that it's quite hard sometimes to employ. I mean, this is the law firms in particular. It's quite hard to get an even number of men at the graduate stage, because the women do actually communicate often very well, and they've got the results to back it as well. So really, if you were being entirely meritocratic, you would just employ the women at that stage based on their results. But of course, that is not sensible, and we believe in having diverse, as I do, a diverse workforce. And so women at the moment, in terms of law firms, probably come in about 60% are women. But what we know is that something changes further down the line. So we have this idea that young women, think of training still as being remedial as opposed to enhancing. And so that's still an issue, despite the fact I set up executive coaching in 1994. And a big part of what I was communicating was, to get an executive coach, you need to be good. It's not about putting you right. It's actually about providing an escalator rather than the stairs all the time. So that's the first part. So the bridge at the beginning, you've got women who just think that, a lot of women think that the problem's solved. Then 80% of those women will become mothers, 80%, roughly about 80% will become mothers. And that's when there's a chicane in the road. And that's when the bridge, if you like, is disrupted, because they don't realise that to be able to have a baby, to go off and come back, is much more complicated than they recognise. And equally for managers, they don't really know still how the best way to deal with this is. And so they quite often get it wrong accidentally by, let's not let's not bother her. She's off on mat leave, so we'll not bother her. And so what happens then is you're starting to get roads off the bridge, the ramping off of the bridge. Now, when we first started with parental transition coaching, it was about 70% of women came back, and so 30% didn't. Now, nearly 100% come back. And I'm not suggesting for a minute this is all down to parental transition coaching, but as you know, the dual career couple is becoming, and also solo parents, women that are solo parents, that's becoming much more prevalent. The female breadwinner, if you like, is on the rise, and so one would expect them to come back. However, when they do come back, and I do see this in coaching, there is understandably a concern that they might come back into a job that they might want to be able to control it better, control their hours, the flexibility. But actually, what really is going on as well is that the system itself hasn't been designed to accommodate that period of time very well. Even though we've had the pandemic and we've had remote working, it's already, we can feel there is a bit of a march back to the office beginning to happen. And that doesn't favour anyone with caring responsibilities at all, because remote working, the ability to flex your work, is critical to anyone who's got any kind of caring responsibility. So therefore, that's where the bridge is broken. And then when you get to the other side, some women power through that and make it through. And those sometimes can become, not all of them at all, but some become, unfortunately, anti-role models, because they assume, because they've done it, they've powered through, they've maybe delegated all the childcare, they've maybe done it in a certain way, they've maybe got a house husband, they've maybe done it in a certain way that isn't maybe desirable for everyone. And so they have an expectation and an assumption that anyone can do it like that. But then of course there are other women, and I put myself in this category, and I think Julie, you would put it in this category as well, is that we may not have personally experienced this disruption in the bridge, but we can see it for what it is, and that we recognise that the system needs changing. So that's the broken bridge. Now, to be able to accommodate that understanding of the different phases that women are at, rather than see women en masse as agreeing and expecting, if they all agree, then that's fine. I think leaders need to have the inclusivity. They need to understand that people are at different stages, and therefore they need to listen up to the different stages and not make assumptions about what's right and wrong based on the most vocal group. Because definitely the least vocal group are the group that are in the bridge that's ruptured, because they're just trying to stay on the bridge. I mean, and so the last thing they want to do is advocate for change, because actually what a lot of them are doing is just trying to hang on for dear life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's tough.
Yeah.
And so you're not going to be advocating for change. So the very people that I think get the realisation, oh my God, this is tough. This isn't as straightforward. It's not a level playing field. Those are the ones that you would hope to be the advocates, but they're too busy, too tired to be the advocates. And then you've got the younger women that don't see it. And then you've got maybe half the older women that don't see either, because maybe they're exceptional. They got through because basically they're exceptional.
Yeah. Oh, it's really fascinating, that metaphor, and it's so visual to see the different roads that women can take, either by happenstance, consciously or unconsciously, before they even arrive at that bridge, and how you notice that and then realise we need to start intervening earlier. We need our coaching interventions earlier so that those women are supported and kind of enabled to recognise that system almost, and to be supported around it when they get to that point. Ordinarily, we would think of executive coaching as being for, middle or more senior people, but having that intervention early sounds absolutely vital from your experience.
Oh, it's critical, and it's not about fixing them, it is about fixing the system.
Yeah.
But what you have to do is you have to take the scales away from women's eyes about the system. You have to actually educate them as to what's ahead. Always very difficult to do, because, as I said, a lot of people that are hired into the system, a lot of the people into corporate structures are hired because they are type A personality. They are, they've got self-belief, and they think they'll power through, and they also think it's anachronistic to talk about gender difference. Yeah. Which makes it all the more complex, because it does sound old-fashioned to be talking about gender binary, when actual fact younger people don't really want to hear that, and quite rightly are moving to a more gender neutral position. But the problem is the world, the system in which they're operating, hasn't yet got the message. They didn't get the memo. And so that's why it needs changing, is to accommodate exactly what they're saying, which is that this should be an even playing field for people of all genders. And funnily enough, I get accused of reinforcing gender binary sometimes by going on about coaching women. But that's because people are trying to jump to the end place before we've got there. And one of the things that hasn't changed is even just yesterday in the taxi, I was getting dropped off somewhere, and God knows how the taxi driver started talking about this, but he was talking about, I'm getting so sick of all this PC stuff. If I hear one more, I don't want to identify as a woman. It's so annoying, don't you find? And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, if only you knew. And I was like, weary. And he says, I believe in a meritocracy. And I just thought I couldn't resist it. And I said, well, if you believe in a meritocracy, why are so many white men running everything? And it's weird how I just can't understand how you can actually express that. I believe in a meritocracy, and look around the world and think you're in a meritocracy. Because therefore you must be thinking, well, it's only right that predominantly white men. And of course, what we're now experiencing, which is a worry, is that there is this huge backlash that's beginning, and I think in America it's really gathering momentum, a backlash against what's seen to be the woke culture. And I think hiding behind that anti-woke backlash is a real radical conservatism, which is about trying to keep things exactly as they are now. And it is anti-change. And so I think it's worrying that, you've got your taxi drivers and, and friends as well, people generally. I'm getting sick of it. I'm getting sick of everything's so PC. It's irritating. And I particularly hate the combination of that with the cancel culture. So that if anyone just says something remotely wrong, it's perceived to be wrong instead of expressing views, and it's just not helpful for a growth mindset for society.
Exactly. It closes things down. I loved what you said there with kind of the world hasn't got the memo. We're not there yet in terms of, we see gender discrimination, we see sex-based discrimination. There are classes of people that are treated differently. To ignore that seems preposterous to me. But, you know, again, it's like that's part of the water, I guess, that you and I are aware of, but that some people don't wish to see there. So it's like, we've kind of skipped on too far, kind of when people are not wishing to see it and saying everything's fine, everyone can do as they want. I mean, you mentioned earlier as well, when we were touching on leadership, I think, around how important it is to engage men with this conversation. You know, we're both, interested in supporting women and coaching women, but of course we're thinking about systems, and quite often those leaders of those systems are white men, straight white men, usually of a certain age. So how do you feel, get those men engaged and have them contributing to the change when, I think, as you've touched on already, it's not necessarily in their personal interests to have that change come about? So this is an eternal question which we don't need to answer. But what are your thoughts on it, Geraldine? I guess I'm asking.
Well, I think the main thing we have to do is to recognise that just because you're letting other people in doesn't mean there isn't room for you. So I don't think it is a zero-sum game. I also think that the vision of equality that I see is actually enriches men's lives too. I actually do think men are victims and casualties of the system too. Mm-hmm. And in the book, I open my chapter on, I think it's the Engaging Men chapter or the Inclusive Leadership chapter, talking about a chief executive that I coached who had burnt out. And really, I see my role and I still coach a lot of men, you know, because I'm still coaching a lot of chief executives, and so they are predominantly, they are men. And actually, seeing people in this particular chap was at burnout, you know, he was at burnout, and recognising what's happened is he'd become a victim of a system that puts hard work on the altar. And there's no alternative. And what happens when you buy into what are called by Claudia Golden, Harvard business professor, funnily enough, had her book published about the same time as mine, and she came up with exactly the same conclusion, which is she called it greedy jobs.
Yeah.
And I describe in the final chapter of the book how the real culprit is the culture of overwork. And therefore, I think many men are missing out on a much richer life, because let's face it, being with your family and your friends and being able to indulge in hobbies that inspire awe in some level is what it is to be human. And being in the office all day, doing, these ludicrously long 72-hour weeks is just not humane. And actually, I think coaching is very much about helping people to re-engage with their humanity, in fact. And it's to help them ground again, figure out what their purpose is and why they're here and what actually gives them nourishment. And so I think that is helpful for anyone. And people in the system that are doing these 72 hours, it's not sustainable. And indeed, it doesn't make you happy. And so that's why I think actually the vision of success is one where, you can actually have a rich personal life and have a rewarding career, is one that I think which is gender neutral. I think all people have the right to that. And that's the world which I think I would like, an equitable world, which I think it isn't a case of men against women at all. It's just tricky to get there. It's just tricky because it's all very well, but we have set ourselves up domestically often. Not the coming generation, but, the generation in charge has been set up retrospectively. And that's really tough if you've made your career, your life's work, and you do actually have a partner at home who makes the domestic arena, their life's work. And it's really hard. And so therefore, I think men and women that have dedicated their lives to this as well, that are approaching retirement, they suffer huge levels of crisis because it's an identity crisis, because their life has been around work. And actually, I'm not sure that that's healthy for anyone.
It's a wonderful phrase that you expressed in there about our coaching can help people re-engage with their humanity, that kind of the holistic sense of being a human being, which what you've called the real culprit in the book, the sort of the overwork, the capitalist more kind of culture that many of our organisations and institutions have, it does have that dehumanising quality to focus your life disproportionately in kind of one area, even if that area is work. However enriching your work is and however committed to it that you are, can have that sort of, if you're doing the 72-hour week, as you mentioned, have that real dehumanising aspect to it. And I guess when, a question here for us then is as coaches, what role and responsibilities do we have really in relation to the concept of systemic change, I guess? What would be your thoughts around that?
Well, as you know, that's very much the subject of chapters 5 and 6, the second half of the book, where I'm talking about, what right do I, as a coach, have to engage with what I think are the real big issues that are going on in the world today are climate change. And the other one is this culture of overwork. I think as a coach, I was trained, and I've trained others to try and lose your agenda when you're coaching. You need to go into this and almost like you can be a tabula rasa. And I think that's, just a clean slate, and that this, or a mirror, and that's all your role is as a coach. And I tried very hard to be like that. And obviously my innate humanity, and just by being, a human being, prevented my being able to do that. Because of course you're not a mirror. Of course you come to the conversation with a whole set of biases, a whole lens on the world, and actually reframing my role as being a thought partner has really helped me. Now, it doesn't mean that I talk all the time and try and bang on about what I believe in. That would be completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that for a minute, but what I am suggesting in the book is that true authenticity is surely the person that's choosing you needs to have some sense of who you are to be able to choose who you are as a coach. And so in very simple, practical terms, when it comes to the chemistry session, I no longer go in and immediately move into coach mode. I used to. And assume that they'll find the brilliance of my questions opened up, their minds to such an extent that they would always choose me. And actually I then, and I called it a chemistry session, but it was actually not. It was a kind of beauty parade, really. It wasn't a look-see on both parts. It wasn't an even set up at all. Yeah. And so I encourage coaches, you do need to give of yourself in that chemistry session. And so therefore, at that point, I now make the point to say that I am known for the work I do in gender diversity. That's part of a bigger belief system where I believe in a more equitable society, and that leads me to believe in leadership which is inclusive. Yeah. And therefore I need to offer you that as things that I believe in, because irrespective of the fact that I won't be lecturing you, and you can rest assured that won't be the dynamic, what will be the case is that my questions are coming from a place. And I think you need to know the place. So therefore, I think when it comes to coaching with an agenda, and the one that I haven't resolved yet in my practice is how to introduce the bigger idea, and whether to introduce the bigger idea of climate change. It can just feel so far removed from the dialogues that I'm having that I wouldn't say I've cracked that at all, other than just asking about what's going on. Because, and also for my own company, we have become a B corporation.
Excellent.
And so that in itself, I would introduce into the conversation at the beginning, like we're a B Corp, and this is what a B Corp is, to explain that, this is one of the things that we're trying to do. And I know, as a B Corp leader, I know the paradoxes that you face when it comes to, it's not straightforward. You're having to navigate between competing priorities a lot of the time to be a B Corp, because, you have to make money, and at the same time you can't pollute the environment, and at the same time you need to think about the community and your wider stakeholder. And actually, in a sense, that really is my vision of, and it comes in the final chapter, as you know, where it's a bit philosophical, and I talk about maybe we have to have a reset when it comes to just capitalism, because I think where we had religion and we had things in the past, we've kind of replaced it with consumerism, and what we need to think about is, and I think the younger generation are thinking, I mean, their generation rent, they don't want to buy and own, and so they are rethinking, and that's what we need to rethink, and therefore we set up the Good Business Initiative some 5 years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago we set it up, and that is about looking at what good business means, and I think good business is an expression of that I think will become more prevalent.
It's fascinating, Geraldine, and we really moved into sort of the big picture there, and the gender justice, for want of a better word, and climate justice and environmental justice all kind of sit together really in kind of the change that's needed. And I know that the AC did do a series of podcasts around climate change that was different ways that we as coaches can contribute to that. And I guess what you're talking about there in terms of bringing in our agendas very lightly or gently, but what really comes out is being honest and authentic with the client that you're hopefully kind of about to work with. And absolutely, my training was also, as yours, about holding up a mirror, reflecting, and kind of almost erasing yourself and being there in the service of the person in front of you. That was your role, kind of thing. And yet, as with yourself, when people look at me and my website, they see that I'm a diversity and inclusion consultant and trainer as well. So they already have that frame anyway. They already know some of what's important to me. And that's great because it's really important to me. So to pretend that that's not there, and yet, as you say, really careful not to make our agendas the client's agendas necessarily, but to sort of have that softness around it and hold that space, but to be our authentic selves. Otherwise we're kind of dehumanizing ourselves in some respects, because we are whole people sitting here supporting with it and working with a client. And I love your phrase, thought partner, a thought partner for that client in front of us, and that for them to kind of express and sort of bounce ideas around with us. And that's kind of, I guess, where we come to in terms of a role that coaches can have to support that reflexivity.
And I think, obviously, with coaching, you really need to know how to enter a conversation where you're truly asking open-ended questions and you're truly curious about where that person's going to go. And I think, in some ways, I talk about this in inclusive leadership, which is, in some ways, I think it's almost a philosophy. It's a stance to be curious. And I think it is quite hard to train that curiosity in. And I don't know how it's come about where I genuinely am interested in the landscape of another person's mind. I mean, I genuinely want to know, well, how do you see it? And so that leads me to ask questions which even can sound closed, but are not actually, because I'm led by the intrigue as to how they see it. And part of that is I don't think I'm, and I think this is quite helpful, not being a very controlling individual. I tend not to see one path. I tend to be curious about multiple paths. And therefore that, I think, allows me to travel down other people's paths and not to try and get them onto my. So I think that's different than this is who I am and this is who my values are. This is about when you're trying to solve a problem with another individual, I genuinely believe they're in a far better position to solve that problem than I am, because I've got a tiny percentage of the insight that they've got. And what my role there is to ask curious questions and also to give them feedback about their potential blind spots to help them understand, might you be seeing this from that perspective because of your experience? Not my ways, this is how you should look at it, much more what, coaching is all about, that self-awareness piece. It's helping people to have the self-awareness to know where they might have a blind spot. And that's what I found, as a coach, that I've found incredibly useful in life, is as a coach, your self-awareness is constantly being burnished. and understanding where you do have make assumptions about what's right about the world, and then you're happily divested of that opinion by someone new coming in and giving you a new perspective on it.
Yeah.
And I'm open to that. I don't have a fixed view of... So someone could come in and genuinely persuade me that inclusive leadership's a load of rubbish and that I should be looking at it from... I genuinely am open to the possibility that I'm completely deluded. And that, I think, is, if you're a coach or if you're thinking of being a coach, then keeping yourself open to the possibility that you're completely wrong is entirely useful as a coach.
That's such a lovely way of expressing it and thinking about it. We may be completely wrong, folks. But I think that the idea of that being that thought partnership and the genuinely equitable space means that we are learning as coaches. It's, we're not kind of holding a space only for one person to learn, but we do hold that a very equitable space if we create that trust and that kind of openness and curiosity, which is part of, I guess, what runs through most coaches, which is one of the reasons that we're kind of in this kind of role. So it's been wonderful speaking with you, Geraldine. I guess we're coming towards the end of our conversation now, but I just wondered if people are listening to this, how might they be able to get in touch with you if they wish to? There will be some show notes and stuff if people want to click on their phones and find that. But if you want to just express how they could get in touch with you if they wish to follow up any of this conversation.
Well, we have a website which is called www.executive-coaching.co.uk. And I'm Geraldine at executive-coaching.co.uk. And so always interested to hear and receive feedback and challenge to the way I'm thinking. So I'd be delighted to hear from any listener.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. So I guess before we leave, do you have any final thoughts, perhaps things that we haven't covered, or a final reflection for listeners?
I think I'd just like to end on saying that I think this more inclusive society that I envisage is achievable, and that we shouldn't lose hope in the face of what feel like the last, I hope, gasps of totalitarianism that is going on around us at a global level. That I think we should still hold out for, that there is an equitable leadership style that could and will prevail.
That's a lovely, hopeful ending to leave listeners with. So, Geraldine, it really has been a genuine pleasure to speak with you today and to just have this opportunity to explore some of these big picture issues which really help set the frame for our idea around kind of coaching women. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been a genuine pleasure.
Thank you, Julie, for asking.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or explore our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. There you can keep up to date with our latest podcast episodes, enjoy the wealth of digital learning offerings, and gain insights from our Coaching Perspectives magazine.